Competition policy is exciting again. In the last number of years, we have seen a newly energized competition agenda with pending cases, including those against many of the big tech firms in Silicon Valley. I think we now face a moment of uncertainty and importance with a change in administration and with, I think, real questions about the direction that competition policy will take moving forward. I get to introduce Greg Rosston, and then Greg is going to introduce the rest of the panel. Greg is the Gordon Kane Senior Fellow at SIEPR. As I mentioned earlier, he was the interim director this fall. He was a longtime deputy director for almost 2 decades. Greg is the director of Stanford's public policy program, a professor of economics by courtesy. He teaches courses on economic policy analysis, personal finance, writing, and rhetoric. Greg served as a deputy chief economist at the FCC, working on the implementation of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. He helped design and implement the first ever spectrum auction in the United States. He's co-chaired the Economy, Globalization, and Trade Committee for the Obama campaign. He was a member of the Obama transition team. With that, I'm happy to turn things over to Greg.
Thanks, Neil. So before we get started, I want to say, it was a real honor to be able to serve as the interim director of SIEPR this fall. I love the organization and my time as director, and I think, as you have seen in the last hour or so, that Neil's going to do great things to continue to build SIEPR and economic policy here. I was thrilled when Neil took over on January 1st, probably more than anyone else, having been. It was great to see that my boss's boss did such a great job here, and you guys hopefully are feeling that Stanford is in good hands with John as well. So moving on to antitrust, Silicon Valley didn't pay much attention to antitrust policy until the mid-1990s as the Microsoft case geared up. Even then, most companies just worried about their product, getting customers, doing their jobs, and of course, as you guys all know, raising money. So here in Silicon Valley, innovation is the name of the game. But how should we think about competition and innovation? Antitrust policy has grappled with this question, and the rise of these big tech companies brings it into focus again. And does the rise of these big companies enhance innovation in the ways that Schumpeter would have envisioned the gales of creative destruction, where they're at a constant threat of the next new thing? Or do they achieve dominance and then use their position to inhibit new competitors from threatening them? The answer is assuredly not at either end of the spectrum, but there's something in between, and at times trying to figure out what goes on. There's been incredible innovations, but actions that make it harder for new competitors. And so this is where antitrust policy comes in, and enforcement has to make judgment calls about firms' actions. And I like to think that economics has provided a framework for thinking about how this competition works and issues to understand the trade-offs. The economics framework is reflected in many ways in what are the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission merger guidelines that were brought into the modern era in the early 1980s under Stanford law professor Bill Baxter, who also happened to be one of my dissertation advisors when he was head of the antitrust division. More recently, all 3 members of this panel have played a significant part in revisions to these guidelines to reflect more current economic thinking. We have a limited time up here, so my introduction to the panel is going to be short. You all have the program in front of you, but the panelists, so you can read about them. We have, in alphabetical order, Susan Athey, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Business, Dennis Carlton, who is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Chicago, and Howard Shelanski, professor of law at Georgetown University. And they're all leading academics who have done a lot of research on competition policy issues. In addition, they've all had leading roles at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission as antitrust enforcers. They've also worked for private clients, and so I've been asked to give a blanket disclaimer for them all that what they're going to say here are their personal views. They don't reflect their clients. They don't reflect the government. Finally, I was lucky enough to be able to put this panel together, and it was great to be able to pick people that I respect and like and have fun with, so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And we're gonna try and do it, they're each gonna give a short 5-minute or so introductory remarks, and then we're gonna be a discussion, and then in the tradition of SIEPR, go to you guys for questions. So first, and I'm not gonna introduce them each in between each one, so we're gonna go first with Dennis, and then Susan, and then Howard are gonna come up. So Dennis, it's all yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Technological progress is the main source of improvements in living standards. And high tech is producing new products at an astonishing pace. New products get introduced into the consumer marketplace faster than they ever have before. It can be really hard, as I'm sure this panel discussion will illustrate, to predict which firms are going to be the successful ones in a few years and which firms are going to come up with the great new ideas. My concern is that competition policy / regulation will interfere with this ongoing process and will hobble competition by not allowing efficient firms to form and compete. This does not mean there's no role for antitrust or regulation, but I urge caution since antitrust is really hard to apply and the benefits can often be overstated relative to these costs. So before I go through and explain some of the complications, let me just go through a few reasons for my concern that's based on empirics. So a few months ago, I had someone put together lists of the top R&D expenditures by company. So let me just read them to you. Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Apple, Microsoft. You notice anything about that list? They are all firms that have been sued under the antitrust laws, and many, if not all of them, have been charged with conduct that has cut back on innovation. That should give you a little pause, I think. And let me contrast, in terms of regulatory environment, the EU, which is much more interventionist than the United States, to the United States. How many of those top firms, I wrote down the top 25, how many of the top 10 are European? Answer, 0. How many of the top 15? Answer, 0. How many of the top 25? 2. So these are the facts that explain the basis for my fear. Now, what makes it so hard, so challenging to apply antitrust to high tech? Probably don't have to go through it for people in this room, but there are 3 characteristics I want to focus on. The first one, there's a first mover advantage combined with scale economies, scope economies, network economies, whatever you want to call them, plus massive R&D expenditures. This means that it's efficient to get big fast. It also means it's really advantageous to hobble your rivals at the early stages. Second, there are lots of new products coming out every day from new firms as well as from existing firms. And it's very hard to predict. It's very speculative to predict what firms are going to come up with the next new product, which new firm is going to develop, which old firm is going to go into decline. Third, the high-tech sector, you can describe it as an ecosystem of complementary products. And the question of how you monetize a product, a good idea, is critical. And there can be someone who has a great app. I come up with a great game app. Well, that doesn't mean no good if I don't know how to monetize it. And then if the antitrust authorities don't let me sell that game app to some firm who knows how to monetize it better than I do, I don't make any money. So that'll diminish my incentive to start out as an entrepreneur in the first place. That's some of the things I'm worried about. Now, you might ask, doesn't high tech raise specific issues to worry about? And I'm sure we'll talk about some of those on the panel. Of course, the answer is yes. But I want to highlight just one. Self-preferencing. That word has appeared very frequently recently, and it's taken on a pejorative meaning. Now, let's suppose I manufacture a machine, and I figure out that I can save money if I start manufacturing bolts in the machine for myself. I'll become a more efficient firm, I'll save money, and I'll be a better competitor. That's called self-preferencing. That's what vertical integration is all about. Now, I can understand how other bolt manufacturers, those rivals, bolt manufacturers, are going to be upset by my decision. But that's life. That's competition. Banning self-preferencing is akin to imposing a duty to deal with rivals. We don't have a duty to deal under the precedents of the Supreme Court, at least in the United States. When you have a duty to deal, someone has to tell you, at what price do you deal with your rivals? Who's going to set that price? Interoperability requirements are a duty to deal. And although sometimes, as I'm sure we will hear in some of the other opening remarks, and I agree that sometimes banning self-preferencing or mandating interoperability, think of cell phones, can be desirable. My worry is that it can create an incentive that freezes investment. If you tell me what price to sell to my rival, why should I make an investment if I have to share it with my rival at a price that I think is arbitrary and too low? And there are a lot of examples of regulations in the United States where interoperability led to restrictions in competition, in investment. So what's my bottom line going forward? I think for the antitrust authorities, I think there'll be continued scrutiny of high tech. I think the DOJ and FTC are much more likely to accept the remedies. Perhaps we can talk about that on the panel. My fear is that speculation about how a firm will succeed or might succeed in the future will be used to justify intervention that will restrict efficient deal making. My fear is that the desire to protect rivals will be confused with the desire to protect competition and promote competition and lead to regulation. But do not misinterpret what I say as asking for no antitrust or regulation. Just that any such policy should be based on evidence, not speculation, and we have to be sure to consider not just the possible benefits from our actions, but also the possibility of large costs. Thank you very much.
All right, well, so I think I'll pick up where Dennis left off, but before I do that, let me actually give a couple of perspectives of how I've come to weigh some of the trade-offs that Dennis described. So actually, unlike maybe the other folks, a lot of my academic research was not about antitrust. I've written about market design and designing markets, and then I got interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and so a lot of my research has been on kind of the operations of making markets work well. But I kind of got pulled into this antitrust discussion starting when I took a break from academics to be chief economist from Microsoft between 2007 and 2012. Now, in that time period, I was working on the new products, the number 2 products, the number 3 products, not the number 1 products. And so I had the lived experience of having billions of dollars at your disposal to try to enter markets and seeing how they can be blocked by incumbents. And in some sense, a lot of people were using Microsoft's past tricks against them. But nonetheless, the tricks were effective, whether in competition, search, or mobile, or other directions. After I stopped doing that, I was on the boards of directors of 5 different medium and large, but not largest tech companies, and spent a lot of time trying to understand, how these firms could enter, compete, and grow in a venture-funded environment. And so one of the things that we hear a lot about in talking about antitrust is, oh my gosh, if I can't sell to Google, then nobody will ever invest in me. And that is, of course, a concern, and so, but it's been said many times. The thing that people are often less comfortable saying in public, but you see inside the companies, is the other thing you need to get investment is you actually have to be able to have the value of a customer be greater than the customer acquisition cost. And if you're going along with one model and then there's one player that gets between you and your customer, and that player does something that takes all your traffic away or raises your price, and then there's no customer service to call, well, that's very bad for your business too. I've had months where I had 4 different board meetings cancel large R&D projects, so Dennis was talking about R&D, because the price of Google Ads went up, or they were kicked out of the home screen that month, and that was going to go directly into their investment decisions. So so there's 2 sides of the coin, and I think Silicon Valley has started using some language around little tech and big tech. Most little tech is a customer of big tech. And if the prices go up for your inputs or you're foreclosed from getting access to your customers, then you're not going to survive either. And of course, one firm might exit and get a great deal and have some kind of acqui-hire, but a whole bunch of other firms might just get crushed and die. So the overall ecosystem can still be healthier if there's not a monopolist between them and their customer, and if they're able to actually compete on the merits. So in the last administration, I spent 2 years, that was my first stint in government as chief economist at the Antitrust Division. And there, my boss actually had a great quote, which is, antitrust policy is a love letter to capitalism. Capitalism works when markets work. If there's no antitrust policy, monopolies are more profitable than independent firms, so firms just would merge to monopoly. So, and that is not pro-growth. That doesn't lead to most output. We need, and additionally, people need to be able to compare prices. They need to be able to switch vendors. If one vendor's providing them bad customer service, they need to be able to switch to another. That's the pressure that makes capitalism work. And so one of the big emphases of kind of modern antitrust policy is to ensure that we are thinking more broadly about what are the important companies and products whose actions might impede investment and innovation for the economy as a whole. And so one reason I think that antitrust policy is much more bipartisan than you would think, it's actually quite bipartisan, is that every state has small businesses. Every politician is an advertiser. If a politician's ads aren't showing 2 weeks before an election, and they don't know why, and then they figure out there's no customer service to call, there's nothing you can do. You just won't reach your consumers. Well, why don't you go to the other social media platform? Well, if I want to reach people in this demographic, there might be only one place I can find them at scale. And if my ads aren't showing, I'm out of luck. So that has made a lot of people kind of galvanized about this issue, from the Federalist Society to politicians on the left and right to state attorney generals, both red and blue. So what do we have to do to deal with these things? And why was this hard, actually? Why was this so hard for so long? Why did both Republican and Democratic administrations mostly let these large firms continue to buy up adjacent products and get to the position where they're kind of hard to deal with? Well, it goes back to what Dennis said at the beginning. The basic economics of complements is that if you're making one product and then you buy another complementary product, you'll lower the price, because you're going to realize that if you sell more of product A, that's going to make people want to buy more of product B. And that's a very powerful force. So let's think about the case, just go back to the 90s and think about operating systems and browsers. This theory, the simple theory is that Microsoft would realize that the operating system's more valuable if there's a good browser, so they would make the best browser, or if there was another browser, maybe they should buy the browser. So they should buy Netscape, and then they'll be the most innovative company, because they're going to ones to realize that better browsers make better operating systems. Now, we have a little bit of a factual history here because it wasn't by buying Netscape, it was by killing Netscape. But Microsoft did, in fact, have a monopoly browser for about 10 years. And actually, like, they weren't the most innovative. And of course, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to think about why they weren't the most innovative with their browser. Because, you know, for a while, Apple was very small. Everybody was buying a PC. Everybody who was on the PC was using Internet Explorer. And it didn't really matter if it was good or bad. And so that's so I think the theory that, like, you'll just make the best product if your customers don't have any choice and they're actually not even directly choosing on the product because it's all put in together, I don't think that that is borne out by the factual history. Another thing, we could go back to look at, well, should we have, suppose Microsoft had said they wanted to buy Netscape. Should we have blocked it? Well, the merger guidelines at the time, and actually until 2 years ago, the merger guidelines did not directly address a case like that. Or if they did, what they did say was that would be a good merger because it's a merger of complements. They didn't articulate a theory of why it could be bad. They didn't articulate the theory that if Microsoft bought Netscape, they could actually use that control to stop Apple from growing, for example. They could make sure that the browser didn't work quite as good on Apple. And if somebody tried to enter with a new browser on Windows, they could have tried to make sure that browser didn't really work very well on Windows. And so Netscape was not just a complement to Microsoft. Netscape was also a complement to Microsoft's competitors. It was a complement to new Chromebooks. It was a complement to Apple. In the end, people living their life in the browser is one reason that, you know, Mac was able to, in the end, come back from the dead and have a serious PC business. Of course, why didn't Microsoft do all those bad things? Well, partly like they were under regulatory scrutiny at the time. They could have killed Google, too, very easily, if they weren't under regulatory scrutiny, because they could have just, you know, forced everybody, just like the Google phone does today, they could have forced everybody to use their browser and their search engine. But it was regulatory scrutiny that allowed Chrome to enter, that allowed the Google search to enter. So what we did, one of the things we did in the Biden administration is we took the 2010 merger guidelines. This was my job, I was writing. I took every sentence from the 2010 merger guidelines and tried to write it more eloquently and more easily accessible to the business community, but basically every sentence stayed in some form. The concepts all stayed, but we added some things. And one of the things we added was the framework for thinking about what to do when a monopolist wants to buy an adjacent product. So the first Trump administration already started bringing these cases. They sued to block AT&T Time Warner. They lost, but they sued to block that. They also blocked Visa's acquisition of Plaid, where Plaid is a fintech provider, which would have been also a complement to Visa's competitors and to new upstart competitors. So 2 cases brought by the first Trump administration under these theories, but where these theories were not articulated in any guidance to businesses. They also started the Apple and Google investigations in the first Trump administration. And the Biden administration continued that work, brought those cases out, won one of the Google cases at trial. The other Google case on ad tech went to trial. And also there's a parallel red state attorney general case that is moving right alongside with the same general theories. So now the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, actually took one of the leaders of the Biden administration's big tech monopolization cases and promoted him to a leadership role in the front office of the Trump FTC. And they've announced that they're going to continue these cases, and they're also going to retain the merger guidelines. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, that's surprising. Not surprising to me at all. I mean, anything could happen today. So, I mean, there's in some sense, we're all surprised every morning, it seems. But nonetheless, you know, this was the most likely outcome, and that's partly because this is a bipartisan issue, and the people that care the most about antitrust actually care a lot, especially about the role that big tech has gotten as an intermediary in the economy, hurting newspapers, small businesses, politicians, and others. So I expect that to continue. Of course, I think some things will change, But in the end, these guidelines kind of just reflect agency practice under both Republican and Democratic administrations when confronted with monopolists. And what did they say? They basically allowed and said, hey, if a firm has been a monopolist for 20 years in an industry, whatever your theory is of what they're going to do, it has to be consistent with the entry barriers that led them to retain those profits. Like classic textbook economics says, unless you have a patent, you don't retain huge profits for that many years. Somebody enters. And if you've been able to thwart every entrant so far, then your theory of what's going to come next also needs to engage with those realities. And the last thing I'll say is that actually several administrations, the case that was brought against Google, that the DOJ won, that had been advocated for 15 years. The facts actually didn't change. But a lot of the previous administrations were afraid to bring the case because they didn't know how to bring such a complicated case. And one of the things that we did, we showed how to bring a complicated case by matching the economics with the business realities. And I think that's something like I learned as when I was chief economist at Microsoft, I had to do the economics properly, and then I had to explain them to a board, to a leadership team, to the community. And so if the business people can understand the logic of what's happening, so can a judge. And if it's economically rigorous, it's going to be more understandable because it's going to be right. But oversimplifying and imagining we're in a pure textbook model with free entry and the only choices are to improve quality or lower price, that's completely divorced from reality. Like the textbook doesn't have in mind that I can change the APIs of the browser and make it hard for someone else to compete in a way that hurts my customers and hurts competition. That's not in the basic textbook model. So you do need your economic case to engage with the strategies and to realize that a lot of if you're a monopolist, you have strategies at your disposal that can help you win that are completely misaligned with efficiency. While a well-functioning market, in order to win customers, you have to make your customers happy. And that's the world that I think the policy should be guided for. Thank you.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm trying to figure out how I let Greg put me after Dennis and Susan, but so I want to talk just a little bit about how we got to the moment where big tech platforms are posing such a difficult policy problem, and a little bit of why the policy problem is different in the way that we're thinking about it and debating it than perhaps antitrust debates were, in the late 20th century. The first thing I'll say is I had a great experience during President Obama's first term. I was running the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission. And I had Susan coming in on behalf of Microsoft to explain to me why this ostensibly very, very powerful company that had just emerged from a decade of antitrust litigation against the government was actually in the position of not being a number one, but being a 2 or a 3, and how actually Google and some of these emerging tech platforms were the real threat. I also got to learn from Dennis, who was writing very relevant articles at the time, but also doing some representation for some of these platforms and the innovation they were providing. And very much trying to weigh this question of regulation to open up innovation on the one hand, or regulation overstepping and interfering with innovation to some degree. And that's been sort of a driving debate of, I think, a lot of the antitrust and competition policy. And I want to broaden things. Susan said antitrust/regulation. I think that's very important because we're starting to look beyond sort of traditional tools of, breaking up companies or enjoining certain anti-competitive behaviors and looking at broader kinds of remedies to try to overcome what we see as some of the competition problems in these big tech platforms. So how did we get here? Just very briefly, tech platforms pose sort of an interesting new phenomenon to some degree in how we think about competition regulation. If you go back 120 years in the United States, the industries that were really important to people's everyday lives and that tended to have monopoly structures were in the United States private, not state-owned, but they were regulated. They were regulated at the state and federal level, and they were regulated to avoid monopoly pricing. And so we had a whole tradition of public utilities regulation where we began to think about, well, competition policy isn't really a thing there. We're talking about limiting the exercise of monopoly power. So it was monopoly control over the large entities that had market power and that were important to everyday life. Antitrust was largely used, certainly for industries that were very important. We all need to eat. Food's an important industry. But there's a lot of competition out there. And so we didn't have this ex-ante system of public utility-style monopoly control regulation. Rather, we had a framework that was designed to keep the playing field open for providing incentives to lower prices, expand output, improve quality, and for new players to be able to get into the marketplace. Big tech platforms are something of a hybrid. They have become vitally important to everyday life. They have tipped in some network industries to monopoly or very high degrees of market power, and yet they are completely unregulated. We have no public utility style regulation. We don't have monopoly control regulation, in part because there's often not a monetary price associated with a lot of the products and services that are involved, but also because these companies are so new. And to Dennis's point, we don't really know whether the giant of today is going to even exist tomorrow. Some publications and very smart people out here in Silicon Valley stated in 2012 that online music was over. It was done. Apple Music had taken over and there would never be any disruption. What is iTunes now in a world of Spotify and other kinds of services? So we now have these very large companies that are vital to important, to parts of everyday life for large numbers of people, to communication, to employment, to education. They're not under public utility regulation, but they seem to be too big and too entrenched for the traditional tools of antitrust to work well. Okay, what is it about their entrenchment that is problematic? Just a couple of quick words about that. Susan talked about how a monopolist could get between Microsoft and a customer in some new line of business and find a way to raise your acquisition costs for that customer or raise your costs of serving that customer. That is a form of customer foreclosure. That makes it harder for an innovator to get access to the customers it needs to make its business profitable. So Dennis makes a very important point, right? If you cannot sell your product and cannot get out there and innovate and take the returns for selling your product, you're not going to innovate. On the other hand, if you are selling your product in a way that gets between someone else that is innovating, you may prevent other innovators from entering the market because they can't get those returns, customer foreclosure. But in a world of AI, of algorithmically driven products that are vital to everyday life, there's another kind of foreclosure that these large platforms may be able to engage in, and that is input foreclosure. If I'm a large language model producer, I need data to train my models. I need huge amounts of high quality data of various kinds. Sure, there's synthetic data. Sure, there are certain kinds of data that are easy to get hold of. But if one of these very large tech platforms has a corner on a range and quality of data that is necessary for training algorithms, that is for refining algorithms, for training models, are they going to have an advantage in moving forward in that highly dynamic and innovative place so that they can use their advantages over this broader ecosystem to move adjacently into, for example, various forms of artificial intelligence, whether it's generative AI, whether it's very specific AI applications built into their various verticals, so that new companies coming into the market can't have access. So when we start to talk about mandated dealing or a duty to deal, there's a trade-off that we need to think about. That is a traditionally offensive concept in antitrust law. We do not want to make firms agree with their competitors or serve their competitors. But in the history of regulation of utilities, right, we've done that very often. We've required railroad companies to allow rival railroads to use their bridges over the Mississippi River. We have required power grids to allow competing generators to wheel their power over those transmission grids. certain forms of interoperability and interconnection have enabled competition and entry. So the balance and the challenge that we're facing right now is how do we blend and draw from this mixed bag of traditional antitrust tools and traditional regulatory tools that come out of the monopoly control era to avoid the customer foreclosure and the input foreclosure of these large tech platforms without deterring those platforms that invest so much, as Dennis showed us, from themselves continuing to innovate and provide the great benefits that they unquestionably provide to the economy and to all of us as users of their various services. So I think we'll probably get into the debate of how we balance and trade those things off in the remainder of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for these opening comments. I think what we kind of what I decided, I guess we, was kind of have you guys react to each other a little bit since you've now heard each other's talks, and there are definitely different points of view about what to do about future innovation, how different forms of antitrust enforcement will impact innovation and going forward, and what firms' actions should be considered pro-innovation and what kinds might be considered harms to the innovative process. And so wondering if you guys, do you want to start, Dennis, again?
Sure. I think I agree with everything Howard and Susan said. I hope they agree with everything I said. It's easy. It's easy to construct economic models in which, if I assume X, Y, and Z, this is harmful, this conduct, or if I assume a different set of conduct, it's pro-competitive, and it's easy to talk about that and then to say, I'm for competition, or I'm for the antitrust laws. The real hard question is, when you're faced with an empirical situation, how are you going to do the trade-off? Now, just let me make a slight detour for a second. When I was at the Department of Justice, I gave and I was also on the Antitrust Modernization Commission at the same time. And I'm listening. I was the only economist there. Everyone else was a lawyer. It was hard to get a word in edgewise. But one point I made is, has anyone studied how good the DOJ and FTC are in their decision making, and compare that to what the defendants say? So you have this situation where two people come in the room. You're in the room and you're listening. The DOJ says, oh, I'm not going to allow this deal because, that company is going to be the future competitive success and drive prices down. And then the defendants say, are you kidding? That guy's about to go bankrupt. He's going down the tubes. If it's not for me saving him, we're going to lose all that valuable stuff. So let the deal go through. And here's my economic model. And they and the DOJ, FTC puts forward their economic model. I say, does everybody keep track of what everybody said and then see who was full of baloney 5 years later? Let's look in retrospect. Whatever happened to that firm who was about to enter and transform the industry? Did it die or did it not? That's what we really need to have a scientific evaluation of our policies. Now, I guess all of us kind of made the point that there are special issues that high tech raises. In part, that's true. I wouldn't say they're new issues. They're issues that may need special emphasis. But I used to teach antitrust law, and when you talk about exclusionary behavior, those actions of conduct that exclude a rival and therefore harm competition, it's a very hard topic, because the same conduct that can exclude and harm your rival is conduct that helps you and helps you compete against your rival and drive prices down. And figuring out that balance is not easy. And then in the high-tech sector, it's exactly the same thing. Now, Susan mentioned how the Trump administration brought actually the first vertical merger case in a very long time, I think 40 years. I was the expert for AT&T Time Warner. So I'm very familiar with the models that were used. And all I can tell you is they were really complicated. You can say, I'm an economist, I can explain it to the judge. You know what the judge says? The judge said the DOJ model, that's like a Rube Goldberg machine, okay? Now, economists can explain, and I should be forced to explain their economic intuition, what's going on. That I agree, and Susan said that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of these models, they're really complicated. And when you have a really complicated model, as I'm sure people in this room understand, you change a few parameters, and all of a sudden you get a very different answer. Well, what's a poor judge to do? Now, Howard raised exactly the right point when he said, we used to regulate industries that we defined as a natural monopoly. Well, that is true. There are several industries, though, that aren't, you wouldn't characterize as a monopoly, you'd characterize them as an oligopoly. That has always been a hard part for a hard situation for antitrust to deal with. Because on the one hand, you don't want to intervene too much because you're going to, you could screw things up. And that's what the history of regulation often shows happened, especially for those of us who looked at what happened in regulation up through the 70s and 80s. And all I can say is when Howard was referring to the railroads and how interoperability worked, I hope people can remember, if maybe there are some people who can, sort of my generation, the railroads went bankrupt, basically. We had to revise the railroads because the regulations had, in a sense, forced many of them into bankruptcy. So regulation is not the end-all and be-all, okay? That's not going to work. And you really have to balance those situations in which you think regulation can help against those where you have to be fearful that the political mechanisms that are involved in regulation will wind up harming things. And it's really hard to do. So I think my bottom line is I kind of agree with everything Howard and Susan have said. All I'm saying is be careful. Don't think you're so confident that you know what the benefits are. You know that it's a harm to a rival rather than a benefit to the firm introducing the exclusionary conduct that you claim is exclusionary conduct that will wind up benefiting consumers with new products. And just be careful what you do, because I understand we can agree there are benefits, but we can also understand that there are big costs, and you got to balance them. The best thing to do is look at what's happened in the past and look at how well you've done in the past. That's my only recommendation. And by the way, we really don't do that.
Great. Go ahead, Susan.
So I'm going to resist the temptation to pick on Dennis a little bit, but so I was actually an expert for the DOJ and AT&T Time Warner, so we were up against each other. I did not create the Rube Goldberg machine. I actually had a kind of a much more boring part of the case. But it was the efficiencies part. And so AT&T and Time Warner argued that the merger should be allowed to go through because they were going to create a beautiful new ad platform that was going to challenge and replace Google. Okay, well, I think I said that I didn't think that was going to happen for a variety of reasons, and there wasn't evidence that it would happen, and I think that turned out to be right. So there's a backward look at it. But you know, a lot of times these deals, I think we have gotten complicated, and I think part of it is that the economists have been they haven't been good enough at popping up a level to the thing that was really driving the business decision. So the models are like down here in the weeds, and that's part of the way academics work, is we look at one tiny point at a time. But we haven't done a good job saying, well, why are they really doing this deal? And if you get the economics right, it will match the business documents. And in fact, you don't need the Rube Goldberg machine, because there's evidence that can come in from customers, from business documents, and so on, that will tell the story. So it's an economic story, because if it's not good economics, it will be wrong. But it's not about the Rube Goldberg machine. And I think that's what we have done. We did well and sort of really laid out a more innovative model in the last years. We showed how to litigate these complicated cases. Some of them were very complicated. And some of them I'm still like, wow, I can't believe we kind of wrote that, like the Ticketmaster Live Nation complaint. is very, very complicated. And I cried many tears late at night in the Department of Justice building trying to figure out how to tell the story correctly and making it less complicated. And sometimes, so it was really, really hard to take, because you have artists and you have promoters and you have big venues and you have small venues, and the venues hire the ticketers and the consumers, buy a ticket from the ticketer. There are a lot of players here, and they have contracts in all directions, and there's bargaining. There's like no linear prices anywhere except maybe for the final consumer. So it was hard. But at the same time, it's like not that hard to explain that if one firm owns all of these pieces, that nobody has choices. So so we had the faith that we could actually tell that story despite the complexity. I want to actually pick up on a different point, though. I think the regulatory point's really important. Actually, when Neil was in the White House, he did some interesting work on things like junk fees. There are some places where we know, and we have a lot of economic research to show that competition actually doesn't work. Like poor people pay hundreds of dollars a year in overdraft fees. Probably nobody in this room pays overdraft fees. But if you're making $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, you're paying $300 or $400 in overdraft fees a year. And competition, and I don't have time to tell you why, but if you can read the research papers, competition is not going to eliminate those fees today or tomorrow. So some kind of regulation on them is just a much simpler way to get what you want. I mean, do we think that like Apple would have spent less money innovating on the iPhone if somebody told them at the beginning, hey, you can do all the things you want, but you can't take 15 basis points of every credit card transaction? I think they would have tried just as hard to build the iPhone. Okay, I don't think the lack of that 15 basis points was stopping them from innovation. But they locked down the NFC radio on the iPhone and put a tax on every iPhone transaction in the world. So, those are places where I'm surprised, frankly, that regulation hasn't come faster. Antitrust lawsuits taking years to play out when, in some level, like, that's just a tax. Like, we don't like taxes. Taxes are bad. I think we all know why. So, like, why do we let people put them? Just because they have market power in an adjacent product. And I think we would have good wallets anyways, like see the Android phone. So I think this is an important point that some places, like if you know what you want, and it's fairly clear, and then just do it through regulation. A final point, this is something, there were many things that were not perfect about the last 4 years. I think communication was a really big one. I just want to give a plug for one of the biggest priorities we had in the Biden administration, none of you probably know about, and it was almost never in the newspaper. We actually had the version of making government more efficient, which was competition policy isn't just about blocking mergers, it's about making sure that you can enter. And so we spent years looking all across government to try to find places where regulation was making it hard to enter. Now, the financial sector was one that was hard to get traction on because it has its own agencies. But if you want to think of like an obvious example, probably a lot of people in this room in finance, fintech has had a very hard time getting in, and there's a lot of entrenched interest that make that happen, make it hard for entry to happen. But it's actually true all across the board. Every part of government has been told by Congress, you must make this safe. And so people are hired to make things safe in the way that Congress told them to do, or to accomplish this one function. They often were not asked, what are the broader consequences for the economy, for the American people? They often weren't asked to make the trade-off. Am I creating a barrier to entry? So every week in my time in the Biden administration, something would come across my desk, and I was redlining it. Often, there's this Administrative Procedures Act, which you're going to be reading more about, as I think we thought it had a lot more bite than some people do. But when you go through to change things, you have to put out requests for comment, requests for information. People submit comments. You have to read them, respond to them, incorporate them. One of the things we did is every time we did that, we made sure there were questions about what will this do to entry? What will this do to small business? And I was redlining to try to make sure, okay, okay, you have a goal. You want to keep AI safe. But what is that going to do to new entrants? And that is a role for economics and a role for competition policy. It's easier to block mergers because like we can just file a lawsuit. I mean, it's hard, but it's a clear path. Trying to make sure that all the other things government do doesn't create entry barriers and frictions, it's not sexy. A lot of times you're doing it quietly because you actually don't want to wake up the entrenched interest. But we did a lot of hard work for that, and I do think that is something that can be a model for future administrations.
Howard, did you want to?
I just want to say something really quick about the relationship between complexity and policy, because it's really where I think the disagreements amongst people who might otherwise be agreeing on a lot of the trade-offs and principles start to emerge. Susan's absolutely right. If all economists were like Susan and were working very hard to put their considerable skills to work at explaining in plain language what the economics mean and how they translate into policy, we'd be better off. But a lot of the economics are just very, very hard, and they get to a point where policymakers and judges have to fall back not on optimizing the models and getting it right, but on presumptions. And those presumptions are going to be very imperfect. And so the question when you start to get to interoperability, and the railroads didn't fail because they had to allow competing railroads to use their bridges. They failed because of the rate regulation and various other kinds of things that burdened that industry. But at a certain point, you have to have a presumption about what kinds of risks you want to run as a policymaker, risks of over-enforcement and risks of under-enforcement. Might you bear some cost of deterring certain kinds of innovation? Might you, or do you want to bear the cost of possibly deterring new entrants and their ability to get the inputs and the customers they need to go forward? Those presumptions are going to arise because getting it right, the data, the models are so complex. And I think the real difference that might come up amongst those of us on the panel or amongst policymakers is what kinds of errors you're willing to run. And I think that Dennis opened up by saying we really don't want to run the errors of over-enforcement and deterring innovation. And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, Dennis, but I sort of took that as a very important cautionary lesson. I think one of the things that came out of the very good work that Susan did in the Biden administration, the 23 guidelines, is a little bit of a different presumption. We're going to look at a lot more factors because all of those factors make us realize there are a lot of effects we may not be aware of. We may want to run the presumption the other way and avoid the risk of under-enforcement. And I think that's where the real difference starts to emerge. So we can agree on the trade-offs and the principles, but I think, at the end of the day, what kind of risks are you willing to run? And I think that what the big tech platforms and a lot of the new industries drive, at least for me, is running more risks of allowing what may be complicated or difficult interoperability, because those are the things that will avoid input foreclosure and keep the ecosystem innovating. So all the people in this room, the wonderful alumni from this wonderful university, keep having, and I'm the parent of a tech entrepreneur and therefore on the cap table, so I'm very attuned to this. Keep people like that going into the marketplace and innovating without worry that they're going to be blocked.
Great. So I'm going to go low tech with an example, and then high tech for a question. So Susan's point about promoting entry, I'm willing to bet that every single person in this room has had a haircut because there are huge barriers to entry, licensing requirements for barbers in every state. If you're a barber and want to move states, you have to be relicensed and retrained and other things like that. There are lots of barriers to entry in all sorts of things. And as we see from Uber and Lyft, breaking down the barriers to entry into the taxi industry, other things like that, barriers to entry are huge and not necessarily a good thing for consumers. They're good for incumbents. But I want to move to thinking about high tech and AI and then go to some audience questions. And thinking about, we kind of danced around how should AI, we've seen the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, which is a huge scale of investment that is that big firms are putting into their models, but we also have OpenAI, which is a new entrant. How should we think about AI and antitrust enforcement? And you have 3 minutes and 40 seconds to do it before we go to the questions from the audience. I don't know who you want to touch.
So I could just say, just to kind of hit back to some of the comments I made earlier. So if you let's not take OpenAI specifically, but suppose you have a new entrant that wants to have a super app. And the super app, and this is now just emerging for those of you who have played with them, but you want something that's going to be able to look at your calendar and book a restaurant and do some research and then, you know, tell you to stop at this shop right here to get what you need. Now, if I'm on a PC, that can work. Like, I just need a web browser, and in there I have, on the PC, I have relationships with all of the e-commerce sites that I work with, and I log in on the web browser. On a phone, you have the top apps have your email, but all the long tail apps, or most of the long tail apps, actually don't have your email. The App Store has it, and you just log in with your Apple ID or a Google ID, and they don't actually have the ability to communicate with you off the platform. In addition, these phones have a history of blocking things. Like, you know, you can't have the Google Play Store unless Google Search and Maps are the default on your phone. Or, you know, you can't have access to the NFC radio on the iPhone unless you go through Apple Wallet and pay 15 basis points. Or you can't do cloud streaming on a browser, any browser, on cloud gaming streaming on the iPhone. So we have a lot of history of blocking access to things. Now somebody wants to come with an AI, and that AI is supposed to be able to, like, interoperate and know where you are and do all these things, and God knows if it's safe, because the people making them don't know that they're safe. So they're going to have a pretty good efficiency argument to say, you know, hey, like, no, this thing can't run wild on your phone. But on the other hand, like, that's going to block innovation, because this thing isn't going to work on the phone very well if it can't interoperate with your other apps. So I would just say, well, that's going to be a new frontier. How are these apps going to actually, how is AI, any AI that's not sponsored by the phone itself, going to actually interoperate with your mobile life? So that's going to be a future battleground, and it's coming soon. And all these trade-offs will come back. Like, who's to say? You know, one's going to say, oh, but I need to keep my phone safe. Like, that's what people are paying for. Versus, like, okay, we're not going to, you know, we're not going to be able to provide our product, and you're blocking us and you're excluding us. My prediction out of this actually is that this is the most likely time in the last, like, 15 years that we will have a new phone, or a new device that's like a phone, because I think the AI people are actually going to want to create a product that the incumbents will not allow in real time, and that litigation, regulation are too slow, and they won't want to wait. So that's a prediction. Not to say that I think it's 100%, but I think I don't actually see how there's another way in the next 3 years.
I would say that AI confirms that the discussion we've been having about the difficulty of balancing the benefits against the costs will be even more difficult for AI. And that AI is going to raise new issues. It's raising issues about copyright that I think will come to the fore. It's going to raise issues about access to data and who controls the data. And you know, there are ethical issues about how it's going to evolve, and as Susan said, who even knows how the AI is working? I think those are central questions, whether an antitrust question or a regulatory question is a matter of dispute. I think it's both. And, you know, I think that when a technology is very rapidly evolving, and you can't even predict, you know, based on the headlines that are coming out every day, what is going to happen. I think it's very hard to start regulating that, because the firms know much more than the regulators. So I just think it's one of those situations where the trade-offs become even more difficult than the ones we've been talking about. But to sort of follow up on what Greg was saying about regulation in barbers, when there is going to be hearings in Congress, and I'm sure there will be, about regulation for either AI or high tech or whatever it is, pay attention to who's supporting the regulations. If it's the big firms supporting the regulations, just remember, regulation typically harms small firms because they don't have the infrastructure to hire a slew of lawyers and economists to lobby Congress and to go into the courts. And I think it's very important to focus on how entry gets adversely affected by regulation. It could be benefited, but it could be adversely affected, and that would worry me. And then finally, I want to agree, I know Susan was on the opposite side, although of me on the AT&T case. It wasn't about, the same issue. But what she said is correct about the efficiencies, and she debated the efficiencies, and I think in retrospect she's right. The company decided to undo some of the transaction. But here's the key point. Who should bear the cost of it? Should the government be going in and saying, hey, businessman, you're about to make a mistake. I'm going to enter the courts, and I'm going to prevent you from losing millions of dollars? Or should the firm say, listen, thank you very much. I don't need your help. If maybe I'll lose $1 million, but maybe I'll make $1 million. Okay? Put that burden on me. So I think that's what we got to be careful of when we're evaluating what's going to happen.
So we should probably go to a
Yeah,
question.
Okay.
10-second clarification. The way that these trials work is that the government shows harm, and if it shows big harm, then they can offset it with efficiency. So they're not just saying, I don't want you to lose money. They're trying to assess whether the efficiency gains offset any harm. In this case, the judge didn't find the harm, so it really didn't matter.
So going for questions from the audience.
Thank you. I'm just kind of curious whether the panel has any opinions about the overregulation of major U.S. tech firms in the EU, whether that has, over time, penalized EU economic progress.
So I think Dennis spoke to that at the beginning. I guess when I do an economic analysis, it makes sense that the US has better scale economies and less frictionless borders inside. So it makes sense that like the US and China are the places where the big tech firms will succeed, and the border frictions in Europe are a big problem. I work for several tech companies on boards and as advisor that were trying to enter Europe. Entering Europe is a hassle. You've got to get all the languages, there's separate regulations in each state. So it's the EU-wide regulation actually was less of a problem for the firms I dealt with than the local regulation, if it's a services marketplace or whatever. So and also payments, you have to get payments in different countries separately. So in some sense, I think the US has these great scale economies, and that's been the most important reason that you go US first. That's actually a business observation as well as an economic observation. One other point is that actually this is like ancient history, but there were a bunch of local search-like products in Europe. So like France had a video player, and that was like a YouTube competitor, and there were local versions of shopping websites that were specialized to the countries. And a lot of those died as Google didn't allow them to advertise and put them off the front screen. So one of the things that got me passionate about this at the beginning was I thought for global economic prosperity and international relations, it was important that Europe participate in the tech revolution. And I was very worried that all of the European entrepreneurs were getting kind of squashed by the US firms. But of course, I think everybody is familiar with the European overregulate argument. I'm not dismissing that. I just wanted to add some things that aren't always in the conversation.
I would just add that Mario Draghi has a report on this, and he is, MIT-trained economist, former Prime Minister of Italy, and he has a long report about how to improve EU and innovativeness, and he takes to task EU's overregulation and intervention. The second thing is, I just want to underscore what Susan said, the global nature of high tech, especially something like AI, gives you pause if countries can give a regulation that will interfere with what you can do generally in your universal platform. And I think AI raises that question in spades, because if we try and do something to regulate AI in one country and the other country just ignores it, then you could be ceding competitive advantage to that other country. Now, you might want to do that, but it raises new questions that I don't think people have completely thought through.
Hi, I had a quick question. I think the FTC and DOJ want to protect the US consumer. What do you think about how CFIUS plays a role? Because it seems like what they're trying to do is protect US companies from getting investments or being acquired by non-US entities. So is that in conflict, and how do you resolve that conflict?
Do you want to go, Howard?
Is the question about CFIUS? I'm sorry. Yep. CFIUS very rarely steps in. I wouldn't view it as a significant impediment to foreign investment. We'll have to see how it plays out in the new administration. But as a general matter, CFIUS isn't out there trying to block foreign investment. It's trying to protect certain national security interests in very limited lines of business. So I don't think it actually, when you look at it in aggregate, it's much of an economic factor.
Okay. I want to thank the panel very much. This has been a great and fun for me.